Welcome to election night. Today I wanted to look at whether the Electoral College favors Republicans, and if it does, how much it favors them, and whether this is a permanent trend that we will see in the coming future by analyzing our history. First, a brief overview of what the Electoral College is. It is the system we use in the United States to elect our president. Each state is apportioned a certain amount of electors. This is a plurality system, not a majority system. So if a candidate were to win 35 to 40% of a state, but then their opponents just win less than that, they get all the electoral votes. They still winner-take-all system. So a candidate does not need to reach 50% of the vote necessarily to win that state's electoral votes. The electoral votes are the amount of senators, which is always 2, and then the amount of House seats a state has, which depends on their population. So for instance, if we look at California, they have 52 House seats, the most in the country, being the most populous state in the country. And then they have 2 Senate seats. So their total comes to 54 electoral votes. That goes to whoever wins their state in the presidential election. Candidates then add up all their electoral votes from the states they won around the country. And whichever candidate reaches 270 electoral votes wins the presidency. This is because there's 538 total electoral votes, so 270 reaches a majority. And in a national sense, a majority must be reached, or else it goes through a whole other process, of which is a little more complicated, isn't super relevant to this video when talking about biases. I will get a little bit into criticisms of the Electoral College later on in the video, but first I want to discuss the topic at hand, which is a bias towards Republicans. Now into historical examples. There has been 5 times where the candidate who lost the popular vote ended up becoming president due to the Electoral College. The first time it happened was 1824, when Andrew Jackson lost to John Quincy Adams, but Andrew Jackson won the popular vote in that election. John Quincy Adams became president. Andrew Jackson would come back 4 years later, would become president anyways. However, didn't happen for another 50 years, when in 1876, Samuel J. Tilden, he won the popular vote to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. But Rutherford B. Hayes barely won the Electoral College. It was by a 1-vote difference. There was a whole constitutional crisis at the time that led to it being that close. Shortly after that, there was in 1888, Grover Cleveland, seeking re-election, lost to the Republican Benjamin Harrison. And then for another 100 odd years, right, the entire century, the 20th century, this scenario never played out. The popular vote winner always won the presidential election. So there was never this controversy until the year 2000 in the race between Republican George Bush and Democrat Al Gore, where Al Gore won the popular vote by about 500,000 votes, but George Bush just barely skimmed by in the Electoral College, where the big case out of that was in Florida, where George Bush in the original count won by 500 votes or so for a state that had a large electoral vote threshold, which would sway the election either way. This went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was a big issue. Then the one that just about everyone probably remembers watching this was in 2016, when Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump in the popular vote by around just over 2%, but then lost the Electoral College by a pretty significant margin of around 70 votes. The primary reason I would give for why there was such a long period of time between 1888 and 2000 where this scenario never played out is because of the competitiveness of elections during that time period. In the Gilded Age, which is that late 1800s, you had a lot of close elections like you have today since the 2000s. During the entire 20th century, most of those elections would be massive landslides in today's standard. So it just never got close enough to where the two of popular vote and Electoral College could really conflict. Now, funny enough, even with party platforms changing over that span of 250 years of the United States, all 5 times where a candidate has won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College has been a Democrat every single time. Whether it's just coincidence, we seek to find out here. At least with the more recent examples of 2000 and 2016, that's what I want to dive a little bit closer into. In our modern political climate, there is this conception that isn't really a misconception, it's just not fully correct, that Republicans do better in small states, Democrats do better in big states. I think most people know that's a little bit too general, because there are Republicans doing good in small states like Wyoming, the Dakotas, Montana, Idaho, but then Democrats also doing good in small states like Vermont, Delaware, arguably New Hampshire and Maine recently, and Rhode Island. So there's examples on both sides of that aisle. For big states as well, Democrats in California, Republicans in Texas and Florida. Why this big state, small state issue is relevant to the Electoral College is that it plays a somewhat role into there being a bias one way or the other. When adding up the electoral votes of a state, of adding in 2 senators and then however many House seats they have, you will have states like Wyoming with 1 House seat. Add 2 Senate seats, you get 3 total electoral votes. That is the minimum in the Electoral College. If you get the largest state like California, that has 52 House seats, but still just 2 Senate seats, so you have 54 electoral points. If you're to divide California's population by their amount of electoral votes, and then divide Wyoming's population by their amount of electoral votes, you get a large discrepancy in the amount of people per electoral vote. You have over 3 times as many Californians per electoral vote than you find Wyoming's per electoral vote. Now, if you were to reapportion these points by a more accurate system, giving each state a similar value of how many voters are represented by an electoral vote, you would make some gaps between candidates shrink a little bit, but it usually wouldn't change much in the grand scheme of things. Take 2016, for example. You had Donald Trump winning over 300 electoral votes. He only needs to get to 270 to win the whole thing. So you have him getting over 300 while still losing the popular vote. So even if you were to reapportion each state's points a little differently, maybe just reapportion out the House, for example. Wyoming gets 1 point instead of 3. California gets 52 instead of 54. A little bit less of a difference, right? You will still get Donald Trump winning that election. The gap between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton will just shrink a little bit. So why is that? The biggest reason why that would be is because of the winner-take-all functionality of the Electoral College. In that election, for example, you have Hillary Clinton driving up huge numbers in states like California, New York, even Illinois, winning California by about 30 percentage points. For reference, that's if she wins 65% of the vote and Donald Trump wins 35% of the vote, that would be a 30-point margin. It gets fudged up a little bit by third-party vote counts. So it doesn't add up directly like that, but that's what the margin means. So she's winning these huge numbers in these big states, which in turn have large electoral vote counts, but you only need to win the state. It does not matter what margin you win it by in this system. So then you had Donald Trump winning states like, iconically in that election, it was Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where he won each of those states by a margin under 1 point, meaning both candidates were near 50-50 in all 3 of those states. However, Donald Trump came ahead of Hillary Clinton in all 3, winning all of the electoral votes of those states. That's the biggest difference driver in this system. So then you take a look outside of that. That's the simple take, right? Those are the electoral votes that got him over the edge, over 270 to win the presidential election. You look elsewhere in the country, you had a close race in Florida, a semi-close race in Texas in 2016 as well. It was under 10 points margin between the candidates. Now, those are both states that put all their electoral votes to Donald Trump. However, he didn't win by astronomical margins. It did not matter though, because it's a winner-take-all system. Now I wanted to analyze whether this coalition bias towards Republicans is still set in place to the modern political climate, not just 2016. There's a metric you can use to look at that gives you a better idea of how far off the Electoral College is from the general popular vote of the country. This is useful because in both 2020 and 2024, the popular vote winner won the presidential election. So Joe Biden won both the popular vote and the Electoral College in 2020, and then Donald Trump won both the popular vote and the Electoral College in 2024. Now, to analyze both 2020 and 2024, I want to use a metric where you take the tipping point state of that election. That is the state that the winner of the Electoral College needed to get over the 270 electoral votes needed to win the election. So if you look at 2016, where Hillary Clinton won by 2.1 percentage points, that is 48.2% of the vote to Donald Trump's 46.1% of the vote. The tipping point state for Donald Trump in that election was Wisconsin, where he ended up winning the state by about 0.77%. So very close, less than 1% margin. Now that makes Wisconsin a total of 2.87 points off of the national popular vote margin. Now I calculated back this total through the entire 20th century, and I had to go all the way back to the 1940s to find a value larger than 2.87 for an election. So this was pretty significant in the grand scheme of things. That year 2000 that I mentioned earlier, the Electoral College vote was still so slim between the candidates that the popular vote of the tipping point state, Florida, was still fairly close to the popular vote of the country. It was less than a percentage point. Now we can use this value to look at 2020 and 2024 to see whether this is an ongoing issue hidden by the fact that the candidate winning the popular vote happens to also still be come by in the Electoral College, or whether it's something that's changed recently. Now in 2020, Joe Biden's tipping point state happened to be Wisconsin, just like Donald Trump had in 2016, ironically. And in this case, he won Wisconsin also by under a percentage point, when he won the entire nation by about 4.5 points. So in the 2020 US presidential election where Joe Biden won the presidency, the tipping point state continued to be Wisconsin, and he also carried Wisconsin by under a percentage point, by about 0.6%, while he won the nation as a whole by around 4.5%. So in this case, you're taking 0.6%, subtracting it from 4.5, and you end up getting a difference margin of around 3.9%, which is another percent larger than 2016. So in 2020, it seemed like it was almost getting even crazier than it had in 2016, this bias towards Republicans. However, Joe Biden still won. He did win by 4.5%, so a bit more notable than Hillary Clinton's 2.1%. Now looking into 2024, I wanted to see whether this trend would continue. However, the tipping point state for Donald Trump in 2024 was Pennsylvania this time. And he won Pennsylvania by about 1.7%. And then he won the entire country's popular vote for the first time for him by 1.5%. So there was still a slight bias towards Trump and the Republicans there by 0.2%, taking the 1.7, subtracting the 1.5. However, the 0.2%, when looking through over 20 or 30 different elections, very insignificant, actually very close to zero, one of the closest to zero that we've seen. So is this pointing towards the end of that bias that we were seeing in both 2016 and 2020? Now, reasons for this shift from 2020 to 2024, where Trump wasn't so assisted by the Electoral College voting system, was largely due to where in the country these shifts towards Donald Trump in that popular vote occurred. Fun fact about the 2024 election is that this was the first time we'd seen since 1976 of all the states in the country moving in the same direction politically. This is very surprising given the nature of those elections, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where in the case of 1972 to 1976, you're shifting from a plus 20 point margin for Nixon in 1972. You have the Watergate scandal, other factors leading into it, where then you have Jimmy Carter winning the popular vote by just over 2 points. However, that is In total, about like a 25-point shift. However, in 2020 to 2024, you have Joe Biden winning by 4.5 points, and then Donald Trump winning by 1.5 points. So a 6-point shift, much smaller. Donald Trump managed to shift every single state in his direction. This is due to the relatively small difference in shift between different states. For instance, in 2016, you had states that went even more Democrat, even more towards Hillary Clinton than they had in 2012 to Barack Obama. But then the majority of the country shift towards Donald Trump in that election as well. So there's a big difference between states in that instance. However, in 2024, you really only had about a 10-point gap between the smallest shift for Trump and the largest shift for Trump. The smallest shift you saw was in Utah of just under a percentage point towards Trump. And then the largest shift you saw was in New York with just over a 10-point shift towards Donald Trump. Now, following New York, you had New Jersey as the second largest shift, and then you had Florida. Then after Florida, you had California, then you had Massachusetts, and then you had Texas. Those were the 6 largest shifts you saw in the country in the 2024 US presidential election compared to 2020. Now, when you take the electoral votes of all those states, the smallest state you have in that group is Massachusetts with 11 electoral votes, already above the average of the 50 states in the amount of electoral votes. Then following that, you have New Jersey at 14 electoral votes. And then you have the 4 largest states in the country, New York with 28 electoral votes, Florida with 30 electoral votes, Texas with 40, and then California with 54. So when you take that into account, you have these states with large electoral vote shares, all shifting in the Republican direction. None of these 6 states were states that flipped in direction from who they voted for in 2020 to 2024. Kamala Harris won New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and California, all states that Joe Biden won in 2020. However, the lead was diminished a bit, so that extra vote total on top of winning it all was shrinking down. And then Trump in both Florida and Texas, of which he just withheld from 2020, his vote margin grew in those states. So then all of a sudden you're getting this extra vote share in large Republican states. So it's a sort of evening between the two sides, of which you did not see in the 2020 presidential election. Another factor that's interesting to take into account is the lessening of swing states over time. In our current era, you usually have anywhere from like 5 to 8 swing states that are categorized as a swing state for the election. Hence are the states that end up shifting one way or the other or fought over by the candidates. However, in the past, you had many elections where you had maybe 20 states that were up for grabs in some way or another. One that I can think of off the top of my head is 1960, that election between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. That Kennedy ended up just about winning over. That was one of the tightest popular vote margins in any presidential election ever. However, there were so many states with a margin under 10 points that now is so rare to find. Nowadays, you have Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and then you have Nevada and Arizona. Those were the states categorized as swing states in 2024, much smaller than elections prior. Why this is important to the Electoral College is because you can have a greater disconnect between the states you're winning and the national level. When you're winning so many states by these solid margins, it can skew the popular vote so much in one way or another, rather than a lot of states being closer together in how they vote. Now, is this bias going to come back in 2028 and beyond, or is it going to stay as it was in 2024? In my take, I believe it will return somewhat to what it was in 2016 and 2020. I think that a lot of the groups of which Trump is pulling with worst right now are a lot of the groups in which he improved the most in 2024. So I believe that it's kind of just reverting back to where he was now 6 years ago. Will it play out like that? And can I speak for elections after 2028? Not so much. Coalitions change so much over the span of multiple years. However, in my current prediction, I believe you will still see a Republican skew with the Electoral College. Quick note on that too. This is under the assumption that Republicans will be running a similar campaign that they do to Trump as of now. Obviously, according to the Constitution, there would have to be a different candidate in 2028 than Donald Trump. And then in addition to that, depending on his poll numbers, they may decide to change their platform a bit. So the coalition you could see could change up, and maybe they maintain the coalition that they had in 2024. Hence a pretty balanced field between popular vote and Electoral College. Now take this video as you will with your opinions on the Electoral College. There's lots to critique about it. It's a very old system. In my personal take, I believe it was a system that was created when a state identity was stronger than it is now. In the revolutionary years, you almost associated more with your own state rather than the country as a whole. So I believe it's somewhat dated, disregarding the bias that it skews with in the modern day. I believe it is time to edit it in some way or another so that this major issue doesn't become such a problem in the future. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I am just getting started on this channel. I would like to post once a week, if not every other week, but I'd like to keep a somewhat consistent schedule so to hopefully grow an audience of people who appreciate my content. I hope to see you in the next video.